Circa 1999, Chinese archaeologists found a human skeleton with an amputated right foot. That's because if there's one terrible place to suffer punishment for criminals, it was ancient China. The female was a resident of the Shaanxi province and a victim of Yue, a barbaric ancient Chinese punishment where a criminal's foot was chopped off. Each ruling dynasty had its own set of sentences for its criminals. Which of these was the worst of all? Let's find out today with Newfound History. There's a story of Jesuit missionaries visiting Beijing and remarking that the crime rate there was incredibly low back in the early 17th century compared to their home countries in Europe. Well, everything has a reason. The Chinese punishments and tortures were so brutal that either people obeyed them or suffered the consequences. There was no in between. Torture was used to extract a confession of the crime by the suspect. Still, the only way to save someone from the worst punishments was to have an influential family member. So, how did the punishments begin? The Xia dynasty rises as the first dynasty in Chinese history, roughly between 2205 and 1766 BCE. A growing civilization of farmers also came with an increasing frequency of crimes: theft of cattle, adultery among men and women, and violence. To combat these, China's early penal system came up with an array of fearsome punishments: flogging, beating, whipping, the list goes forth. Most infamous were the so-called 5 punishments. These were a group of grave punishments created to cause intense physical and psychological anguish to its sufferers permanently. The 5 punishments remained between the rise and fall of each dynasty. The core idea behind them is damaging the body of the sufferers in ways that would mark them as offenders for life. The 5 punishments for men were tattooing, cutting off the nose, amputating one or both feet, castration, and death. Let's go through each of these now. Mo, the tattooing, involved brandishing the victim with indelible ink on the face or forehead. The purpose of the tattoo was to mark them as an offender, which, while not immediately harmful to them, unlike the remaining 4 punishments, still alienated them from other society members through humiliation. Yi is where things get gory. The offender's nose was chopped off. Oh, and guess what? This was all done without anesthetic. Imagine that. Yue involved amputation of the left or right foot. Sometimes both. Some historians claim this involved the removal of the kneecap. No matter which, losing part of a limb in ancient China was terrible. There were no prosthetics available. There was a high risk of infection. And, since most peasants earned their living as farmers, it made their job infinitely more grueling. Gong is the removal of the male offender's reproductive organs. Usually, the offender would then be sentenced to work as a eunuch for the imperial family, carrying out mundane tasks for life and having no right to own land. If this wasn't painful enough, offenders were tormented with slurs that they had been made into an ugly woman. Finally, Da Pi is the death sentence. As you might guess, the execution methods were anything but merciful. The idea was never to give the victim a quick death. These included cutting the offender into 4 pieces with a large-toothed saw, boiling them alive, having them dismembered by horse-drawn chariots, strangulation, and death by 1,000 cuts. The list goes on. The Chinese had no shortage of creatively painful punishments. The 5 punishments were used for 4,000 years of Chinese history, although they were only the precursor to one of the most extreme punishments of all time. More on that later. Women were not exempt from the 5 punishments either. The first was Xingchong, the least painful for the body yet most painful for the mind. It governed that guilty women be given a bucket of grain to grind in an amount of time, and if they did not finish by then, you guessed it, they were given another bucket. This repetitive, sleep-depriving tactic saw women go insane, denied rest until their quota was met. The second punishment was zanjing, which used a Chinese finger crusher made of small sticks strung together with cords. When placed around the fingers and pulled, these would cause unbearable pain. The idea was to cause so much pain, the criminal would spontaneously confess their crime. It was such a successful punishment in gaining confessions that a variant was made for men known as the jiagun, the ankle crusher, where 3 wooden planks bound and compressed the feet. The third was jiangjing, the relentless beating with wooden staves. This type of corporal punishment was common for petty crime as a lighter alternative to the more savage punishments. The fourth is qixi, forced suicide. The victim is coerced into taking their own life under threat that something worse would happen if they didn't, such as their entire family would be tortured or they'd be tortured themselves. Some of these methods were hanging yourself or drinking slow-release poison. The final punishment was gongjing, stowed upon any women who committed acts of adultery, which almost always led to torture followed by death. The 5 punishments were the way of law, yet one dynasty went above and beyond to expand on these grim sentences. The Tang dynasty had a goal to create a penal system changed to better fit newly analyzed crimes. They wanted to achieve a culture of valuing one's family honor above all else. Newly targeted crimes included selling a family member into slavery and not providing proper support for an elderly family member. They did everything in their power to support the penal system and overall social order. The power dynamics of their regime made it normal for a father to beat his son, but if a son struck his father, he could be sentenced with da pi and boiled alive. During the Tang dynasty, another set of crimes was known as the 10 abominations. These were divided into 4 major categories. The first of these were crimes against the emperor, such as threatening to carry out a rebellion or a doctor not following the formulas for the emperor's medicine. These crimes would find the offenders begging for mercy, bound to ropes behind the imperial horses. Next, we have all the crimes of treason. These included switching loyalties, killing a superior, or betraying an official or a city. This was best exemplified when the Tang recaptured the capital city of Luoyang from military rebel An Lushan, and they executed 39 of 200 officials who chose to switch sides and fight against them, subjecting them to the torturous death by 1,000 cuts. The Tang's newly revised system saw that there was no room for nonconformity. All crimes were met with the brutality of the 5 punishments, and to show they were really serious, they reintroduced an old punishment, one so extreme it was abolished decades before, the notorious Sanzu. The Sanzu was the extermination of 3 generations. First developed by the Qin dynasty during 221 to 206 BCE, it demanded the execution of the delinquent and all their immediate relatives. It's one of the most notable forms of collective punishment in Asia, and the way it was carried out simply makes the stomach churn, because it applied the 5 punishments to the convicted and their entire family. The family members were the criminal's parents, grandparents, siblings, siblings-in-law, uncles and aunts, the criminal's cousins, spouse, the spouse's parents, and of course the criminal. Even children who fit within those family ties would be executed. Confucian principles prevented the killing of the criminal's sons or daughters under Mencius's principle, being offspring is not a sin. Still, if they were spared, they'd be enslaved regardless. Yikes. The convicts would have their tongues cut off, they'd be tattooed, their noses and feet would be cut off, they'd be flogged, their bodies mutilated, and finally hung up on the streets. Barbaric punishments like the Sanzu have been noted throughout Chinese history and tend to be associated with the Shang and Zhou dynasties. Their military officers would often go as far as to threaten their underlings that they'd exterminate their families if they did not obey orders. lives. Ironically, Chinese jurist and lawmaker Shang Yang during the state of Qin created a Sanzu-style punishment in Qin law, and his whole family was killed following the punishment he formulated himself. The ancient Chinese didn't have a defense, so there was no process for prosecution, defense lawyers, and no jury. Each town only had an office building where the magistrate would pass sentence to the criminals. The process, if it could be called that, involved the witnesses presenting the evidence to the magistrate and determining if they were true. If they were, the offender was punished. Once the magistrate decided if they were guilty, there was no way of proving innocence. Well, maybe that's the reason why the crime rate was so low. Would you have dared to step out of line in ancient China? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching this episode of Newfound History.